On February 15th, 2026, Robert Duvall passed away at his Virginia estate, Burnley Farm, at the age of 95. The official statement was simple. He died peacefully at home, surrounded by love. But what followed had nothing to do with how he died. Within days, the conversation began to shift. It wasn't about his legacy or the films that defined his career, but something no one expected to become the center of the story: his money. For years, his net worth had been widely reported at around $50 million. But after his death, internal figures suggested something very different, more than $20 million higher. So where did that extra money come from? Let's take a closer look at the truth behind it. To understand that, you have to look beyond the surface of his career, starting with how Hollywood wealth actually works. The hidden layers behind Robert Duvall's $70 million. The first layer was something most people rarely think about when they look at an actor's career: what happens after the work is done. Duvall's roles in The Godfather, Apocalypse Now, and Lonesome Dove didn't just define his reputation at the time. They continued generating income long after their original release. By the late 2000s, these films had become part of a permanent rotation across cable television, international syndication, and eventually streaming platforms. Each licensing deal, each re-release, extended the life of those earnings. Over time, that kind of income doesn't feel dramatic, but it accumulates. By conservative industry estimates, Duvall's catalog was still bringing in between $1 million and $2 million a year well into his 80s and 90s. Across the final 15 years of his life, that alone could have added $15 to $30 million without a single new performance. But even that steady stream of income doesn't fully explain the gap between $50 million and $70 million. Because at a certain point, Duvall stopped relying only on what he earned and started shaping how he earned it. When he founded Butcher's Run Films in 1992, it wasn't about visibility or status. It was about control. Instead of simply accepting roles, he began choosing projects where he could also participate in the financial structure, helping finance them, retaining creative authority, and sharing in the long-term returns. His film The Apostle is the clearest example. When studios hesitated, he backed the project himself, took on multiple roles behind the scenes, and kept a stake in its success beyond the box office. It didn't instantly transform his financial position, but it changed the direction. From that point forward, part of his income was no longer tied just to salaries. It was tied to ownership. And then there was the third layer, one that never looked like a financial strategy at all. Burnley Farm, the 360-acre estate he purchased in Virginia in the early 1990s, was never presented as an investment. It was where he chose to live. But over time, it became something else as well. Located in Fauquier County, an area shaped by land preservation laws and limited development, the property steadily increased in value year after year. By the mid-2020s, comparable land in that region was valued between $15,000 and $25,000 per acre, placing the land alone somewhere between $5 million and $9 million, without accounting for the farmhouse, barns, or additional improvements. Unlike more volatile assets, this was value that didn't fluctuate dramatically. It simply held and grew quietly in the background. Even his smaller real estate decisions followed that same pattern. The West Hollywood property he purchased in 2008 for $1.1 million and sold in 2017 for around $2 million wasn't a bold move. It was patience, a steady increase over time without attention. And when you place all of these pieces together, residual income building year after year, selective ownership through production, and land that appreciated while he lived on it, the difference between $50 million and $70 million no longer feels surprising. It feels inevitable. But what made the discovery resonate wasn't just the number itself. It was what that number revealed. Because much of this wealth had been built quietly, structured quietly, and largely kept out of view. When the full picture began to surface, it didn't just change how people saw his finances, it changed how those closest to him understood his life. There were income streams they hadn't followed, accounts they didn't fully know about, and long-term holdings that had never been part of everyday conversation. And when everything came into focus at once, it brought with it something more complicated than surprise. It brought distance. The $70 million wasn't just a measure of success. It was a reflection of how much of Robert Duvall's life had unfolded quietly, in parallel, carefully built, deliberately managed, and in many ways kept to himself until the very end. Why Robert Duvall left Hollywood for Burnley Farm. If you want to understand Robert Duvall more, you don't start with the films, the awards, or the reputation he built in Hollywood. You should start with the decision he made in 1994. Because that year, at a time when most actors at his level were moving closer to power, bigger houses in Los Angeles, more visibility, more proximity to studios, Duvall went in the opposite direction. He bought a piece of land in Fauquier County, Virginia, a place most people in the industry had never even heard of, and quietly built his life there. Not as a retreat, not as a second home, but as the center of everything. Burnley Farm was designed to disappear into. The property stretched across more than 360 acres, a scale that doesn't fully register until you walk it. At average agricultural land values in Northern Virginia, ranging between $15,000 and $25,000 per acre in recent years, the land alone represented a multi-million-dollar commitment. But Duvall didn't treat it as an investment in the traditional sense. He wasn't waiting for appreciation. He was buying distance. Distance from noise, from expectation. At the center of the property stood a 5,500-square-foot Georgian farmhouse, originally rooted in early 19th century architecture. It wasn't rebuilt to look modern. It was restored to feel unchanged. Wide plank wood floors, hand-hewn beams, fireplaces that didn't just decorate a room but defined it. Even the renovations, kitchen updates, structural reinforcements, heating systems were done in a way. There were ponds, open fields, and long stretches of land left intentionally untouched surrounded the house. Every morning looked almost the same. Duvall would wake early, often before the light had fully settled over the fields. The first movement of the day wasn't toward a phone or a script. It was toward the barn. Horses needed feeding. Water lines needed checking. The routines were simple, but they were non-negotiable. And that's where the shift in his life becomes clear. There were 8 stables on the property, along with multiple fenced paddocks and a working riding arena. This wasn't decorative ranch life. It functioned. The horses weren't symbols. They were responsibilities. Maintaining them required daily attention, seasonal adjustments, and a level of presence that no assistant could fully replace. And Duvall embraced that. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, when his peers were expanding their public lives, Duvall was narrowing his. He still acted, still took on roles, but every project had to justify pulling him away from Virginia. That shift shows up clearly in his filmography. Fewer roles, more selective choices, longer gaps between appearances. Financially, Burnley Farm made sense, but emotionally, it did something more important. It gave him control over how his days felt. There's a difference between owning property and belonging to a place. Duvall crossed that line quietly. Locals in Fauquier County didn't experience him as a celebrity passing through. He attended community meetings. He spoke publicly against developments he believed would damage the land, including opposition to large-scale commercial projects near historically preserved areas. He wasn't protecting an investment. He was protecting a way of life he had chosen deliberately. Even his appearance reflected that alignment. Boots worn from actual use, not styled for effect. Denim that aged naturally. Jackets that carried years. And that continuity is rare. By the 2000s and into his 90s, Burnley Farm had fully replaced Hollywood as his primary world. He had already chosen where he belonged. And when you look at it closely, the farm explains something that his career alone never could. He spent it trying to become stable. And in the end, Burnley Farm wasn't just where he lived. It was the proof that he succeeded. Robert Duvall's 4 marriages and the life he couldn't keep. Robert Duvall's personal life becomes much clearer when you place his relationships next to the timeline of his career and the intensity of his working habits. He was married 4 times over a period of more than 40 years, yet never had biological children, and none of his first 3 marriages lasted longer than 11 years. His first marriage to Barbara Benjamin began in 1964, at the exact moment his career was beginning to stabilize after years of small television roles and theater work. During that period, he was working consistently, but not yet earning major film salaries. The marriage lasted until 1975, a span of 11 years, which makes it the longest of his early relationships. During that time, he helped raise her 2 daughters from a previous marriage, Susan and Nancy. This is the only period in his life where he lived continuously in a family structure with children. However, even during those years, his workload was increasing. Between 1962 and 1974, he appeared in dozens of television productions and films, including To Kill a Mockingbird and The Godfather. That level of output required long shooting schedules, travel, and extended time away from home, which directly affected how much continuity he could maintain in daily family life. His second marriage to Gail Young started in 1982, just 1 year before he won the Academy Award for Tender Mercies. At that stage, his career had moved into a higher earning bracket, with salaries reaching between $1 million and $3 million per film. The increase in income came with increased demand. During the early to mid-1980s, he was working across both film and stage, including major productions and Broadway performances. The marriage lasted 4 years, ending in 1986. Gail Youngs later described him as highly driven and focused on perfection. His third marriage to Sharon Brophy followed a similar pattern. They met through tango classes in New York in the late 1980s, married in 1991, and divorced in 1995. During this period, Duvall was not slowing down. He had just completed Lonesome Dove in 1989, one of the most successful television miniseries of its time, and continued working in films and production. The marriage lasted 4 years, the same duration as his second. Across these 3 relationships, the average length was approximately 6 to 7 years, with each ending occurring during periods of sustained professional activity. The question of children is equally specific. Across 4 marriages and multiple long-term relationships, he never had biological children. In a 2007 interview, he acknowledged that he had tried and had also considered adoption, but did not proceed. This is not a vague statement. It indicates that the absence of children was not purely accidental, but involved decisions that were not finalized. The only extended experience he had with parenting was during his first marriage, when he helped raise Barbara Benjamin's daughters until 1975. The turning point in his personal life came in the late 1990s when he met Luciana Pedraza in Argentina. At that time, he was in his mid-60s, with 3 marriages behind him and a fully established career. Unlike earlier relationships that formed during periods of rapid professional growth, this one began after his career had reached stability. He was no longer increasing his workload at the same rate, and his annual film appearances had decreased compared to previous decades. The relationship developed around shared activities rather than separate professional paths. Tango was central to this. He trained regularly in Argentina and the United States, and they collaborated on Assassination Tango in 2002, a project he wrote, directed, and starred in. This collaboration created a structure where his work and personal life overlapped instead of competing. They married in 2005, and the relationship lasted more than 20 years, continuing until his death in 2026. This duration alone exceeds any of his previous marriages. The age difference between them, approximately 41 years, did not shorten the relationship as might be expected statistically. Instead, the stability of his career at that stage and the shared daily routine they built contributed to its longevity. By the 2000s and 2010s, Duvall was working less frequently, often taking one project every few years instead of multiple projects annually. This reduction in workload directly increased the amount of time he spent at home, particularly at Burnley Farm in Virginia. His daily life during this period followed a consistent structure. He remained physically active, continued practicing tango, and spent extended PD throughout his life. Despite 4 marriages, he never had biological children. He addressed this reality openly in interviews, acknowledging that he had tried and even considered adoption. His remark, delivered with humor, reflected an acceptance of circumstances rather than regret. The absence of children shaped his life in subtle but important ways. This perspective helps explain why his later years felt more settled than the earlier ones. Rather than trying to meet external expectations, Duvall gradually shaped a life that reflected his own priorities. His relationship with Luciana, his commitment to tango, and his attachment to Burnley Farm all formed part of a structure that supported him without forcing him into roles that had previously proven difficult to maintain. In the end, Robert Duvall's personal life cannot be understood through the lens of convention. It was not defined by a single enduring pattern, but by a series of adjustments that gradually led him towards something more stable. His relationships, including those that ended, were not failures in a simple sense. They were part of a longer process through which he discovered what kind of life he could sustain. It reflected the same qualities that defined his work: patience, attention to detail, and a willingness to refine over time. So looking back at everything, his marriages, his solitude, and the way he lived, do you think he found the kind of life he was truly searching for? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video. Goodbye.